All right. Good afternoon or evening for those of our participants who are across the pond. Our next session is The Spectacle of Bodily Difference in Georgian England, presented by Kither. This session will be immediately followed by another session, so just give us about 30 seconds to switch moderators and switch over. But for now, Alex, go ahead and take over.
Thank you very much. Am I visible and audible?
Yes, you are.
Excellent. Well, before I begin, I'd just like to say thank you to the organisers for arranging this symposium and for allowing me to speak with you today. This paper today aims to consider approaches towards the descriptive cataloguing of historical printed materials depicting bodily difference. Specifically, I intend to highlight some of the ethical challenges posed by this kind of material, illustrated by a case study from the British Library collections, namely Lyson's Collectanea, a scrapbook of primarily printed images, broadsides, and ephemera from the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Through investigation of some of the people represented throughout this volume, I hope to pose some questions regarding how we catalogue visual depictions of historical figures, what vocabulary we apply, and how we maintain a fair balance between functional discoverability and ethical sensitivity in our catalogue records. To provide an overview of what this paper intends to cover, firstly, I'll present some contextual information regarding the collection itself. This will provide a brief account of its content, its compiler, and its history of being in the British Library collections. Following this, I'll pose a number of technical and ethical questions that were raised when we first began cataloguing the collection. I will then consider some of the existing thought around the concept of this disability and bodily difference, and how these attitudes influence the ethics of descriptive cataloguing. This latter part of the paper will examine key examples from the collection and highlight inadequacies in existing controlled vocabularies, as well as a wider problem with the general use of language when describing historical individuals. By the end of this paper, I suspect I will offer up more questions than solutions. However, I hope that this brief presentation can provide a starting point for some meaningful discussion on the matter. And before we begin, I should note that this presentation will contain potentially disturbing and insensitive depictions of disabled people, as well as ableist language and imagery. I will also make use of some historical language in my talk, which would otherwise be considered unacceptable in a modern context. As a point of positionality, I'm a non-disabled person whose association with this material is solely professional. In preparing this paper, I've consulted a number of colleagues, both disabled and non-disabled, who have kindly contributed their own thoughts and advice based on research and lived experience. The subject of this paper is Lyson's Collectanea, a collection of scrapbooks containing a variety of cuttings and advertisements roughly dating from 1660 to 1828. These scrapbooks were compiled by the English antiquarian and topographer Daniel Lyson throughout the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Scrapbooking was a popular pastime among certain social circles in Georgian England, and Daniel Lyson was among an active network of collectors. He was a prolific collector himself of ephemera, and his interests were eclectic, as is reflected by the contents of the Collectanea. Lyson sold his entire scrapbook collection at auction in 1828, 6 years before his death, and from there the collection was dispersed between multiple buyers. We know from annotated sales catalogues that the collection passed through many more hands before partially arriving at the British Museum Library in 1866. Between these years, most of the volumes were physically divided into parts, possibly done by booksellers in an effort to make them easier to sell at auction. Of the 6 original volumes listed in the 1828 sales catalogue, and whose titles can be seen here on the slide, 3 are now in the British Library. Among those which are presently in our collection, I would like to draw your attention to number 3 listed here as accounts of public exhibitions and places of amusements. This section of Lyson's collection, which was originally compiled in 5 volumes, now exists in the British Library as 9, divided by general subject matter, as they were originally organised by Lyson. As the title page suggests, their contents is varied and covers all manner of popular Georgian light amusements, including hot air balloons, sporting and animal menageries. However, as noted in the 1828 sales catalogue description, a section of which is quoted here, it also contains a substantial section dedicated to human exhibition. The title of these volumes, which Lyson devised himself and which he had printed at the Strawberry Hill Press, coincidentally reflects Goffman's 1959 definition of the social construction of freaks. Freaks being an antiquated and inappropriate term to describe, according to Goffman, human exhibits to the public for amusement and profit. And that is precisely what the first volume of the Collectanea contains. Human displays at fairs and on permanent exhibition became a popular form of entertainment in the late 18th century and increasingly grew in popularity throughout the 19th century. The appeal of these displays relied on the pervading fascination with otherness, both culturally and physically. So-called human exhibitions gradually became a significant attraction at charter fairs in England, and exhibitors would often tour the country to be presented at each of these annual festivals. Among these fairs was Barton Fair in Gloucestershire, which was not far from where Daniel Lyson lived. Both print and manuscript evidence in Lyson's own hands suggests that he acquired much of the material in his collection through attendance at this one specific charter fair, though his collection also includes materials acquired in London and indeed elsewhere in England. However, it is important to understand the context in which Lyson met the people represented in his collection and how he managed to gather so much material surrounding the subject. Despite these volumes arriving in the British Museum Library in 1866, our attention was only brought to them last year after digital images of the volumes were made available online during the pandemic. Following digitization, we considered the task of retrospectively cataloguing each of the individual items within the scrapbooks to increase their accessibility and discoverability. Until this point, there had only existed catalogue records for each multi-volume collection, which provided no description of the content of the work beyond its rather unassuming title page. This practice of only recording scrapbooks at the volume level had been a common practice at the British Museum Library, and consequently meant that the value of these items as sources of insight into the experience of marginalized individuals in Georgian England was obfuscated to researchers. This very point was actually acknowledged back in 1985 when the bibliographer R.C. Alston used the Collectanea as a prime example of an item that required far more than a single cursory entry in the library catalogue. Consequently, we began to catalogue the items in the Collectanea and quickly became well aware of the sensitive nature of these materials and the challenges they pose to our descriptive practice. In cataloguing, it was our primary concern to ensure the material was discoverable in our catalogue. The collections posed several technical challenges that required some thought regarding how to ensure these materials were visible to researchers. How would we represent the subjects of these images where we were unable to provide named entries and biographical information? What kind of vocabulary could we use for those descriptions? What kind of subject headings could we apply? And to that end, what vocabulary could we expect our users to be applying when searching for this material? Would they be using antiquated terminology reflected in the textual elements of the material itself? Or would they be applying modern terms to find historical objects? These same questions apply to subject headings and wondering which heading best represented the nature of these collections. For example, were medical subject headings suitable in this case? These practical, technical questions inevitably led us to consider ethical questions also. We realized that while discoverability was important, we also had to balance this consideration with our ethical obligation as cataloguers. Using historical terminology in our descriptions may be easier to find, but what if the vocabulary we adopted could be largely offensive and harmful? Furthermore, would our descriptions echo the voyeuristic and sensationalist nature of the materials themselves? By focusing on the medical nature of bodily difference represented in the images, we were denying the subjects their humanity. And furthermore, what ignorance did we have about disability that could bleed into our records? Now, these are not usually the kind of questions that we ask ourselves as curators of rare books. However, they were completely unavoidable within this collection. These ethical concerns became inextricably linked with our technical questions and consequently forced us to completely reconsider our practice. I have included here 4 questions that could be considered when defining questions in disability studies, and I believe that they fundamentally inform much of our decision-making with this collection. Consequently, it's important to keep these questions in mind as I continue to present a few examples from the Collectanea. For us, then, the most pressing among these questions was to address our own ignorance surrounding disability. It's often our intention when cataloguing to solely describe what is seen before us and not to impose interpretation upon the record. Now, theoretically, this approach should provide some objectivity in the catalogue description and limit any influence of potential biases from the cataloguer. In this instance, that approach encouraged a functional analysis of the bodily differences represented in the material and applying language which we deem to be without inherent values. However, this functional approach to description forced us to identify areas of physical difference as discoverable access points, inherently suggesting a normative body type. This approach was also restricted by our limited understanding of what the images were actually representing in any medical sense. And finally, this approach failed to reflect that these are images of real people, whose representation here communicates something far broader about British society in the Georgian period. Ultimately, the medical model of disability reinforces normative values of physicality and fails to provide a meaningful description of these images. An alternative method to approaching disability is in the social model of disability, which takes focus away from the medical condition of an individual and instead considers that person in relation to the attitudes and structures of society. Now, in the present day, this model of disability largely informs language we use to discuss the subject of bodily difference. For example, disabled individuals are not perceived as passive victims to their medical condition, but through language are given agency, control, and humanity. Generally, this is the approach adopted by institutions, including cultural heritage organisations, charities, and governments in the UK, but also is informally adopted in the language we apply more generally. However, while this latter approach to disability is widely adopted today, what application does this have to historical subjects? The very word and concept of disability would not have been applied to the people of the early 19th century, and the individuals represented in Lyson's Collectanea would not have considered themselves disabled in the way we understand the term. The social model of disability presents people in relation to the prevailing attitudes of the society in which they live. However, the society of Barton Fair is fundamentally different from the one we live in now. Georgian attitudes largely perceive bodily difference as being monstrous, a term which is repeated throughout the source material. Furthermore, not all of the individuals depicted in this volume are disabled by any common modern understanding of the term. This also brings to question how we classify disability, and indeed if we have the right to impose disability upon a subject at all. If disability is a self-ascribed term, then what function is there in describing any of the historical figures in the Collectanea as disabled? A practical example where some of these questions come into play can be found in depictions of Daniel Lambert. Lambert was born in Leicester in the East Midlands of England. He was considered extremely healthy in his youth, famously having wrestled a bear in the streets of Leicester, according to a popular local legend that persists to this day. It was in his early adulthood that he began to gain and retain weight to the point that he was no longer able to fulfill his occupation as a jailer, and having lost his sole source of income, decided to exhibit himself in London as a source of public amusement. A huge number of prints and broadsides of and about Lambert survive today, and he was the subject of much contemporary observation. With all this known, how do we begin to describe Daniel Lambert? The caption of this broadside suggests corpulent Englishman as an appropriate description. Library of Congress subject headings alternatively provide terms such as overweight persons. Perhaps our users may search for other words, including obese or fat. Was Lambert disabled? Perhaps our first thoughts would be not. However, if we are to consider the limitations of his social mobility caused by contemporary attitudes towards his bodily difference, one could argue that by modern definition, Lambert was disabled. Lambert himself claims that a full suit of clothes cost him £20 in 1806, which is approximately £1,700 or $2,000 today. Evidently, his physical difference had a significant impact on his ability to conduct his life. We could further try and medicalize Lambert by identifying and ascribing the cause of his weight gain. In 1806, shortly after arriving in London, Lambert was the subject of an article in the Medical and Physical Journal, which confirmed his weight at 50 stone and measured his height at 5 foot and 11 inches tall. Further to this, the report concluded that Lambert suffered no underlying health problems. When taking into account the full details of the report, Bondeston claims that there is no known medical condition to explain Lambert's weight gain and retention. Even if we could speculate a diagnosis based on this information, is this the most effective or ethical way to describe this image? Will users search for medical terminology when researching Daniel Lambert, or will they rather study his life as part of a social phenomenon of the Georgian period? With most of the subjects in the Collectanea, medical diagnosis is futile, as the information provided by the images is nowhere near enough to provide the basis of a reliable conclusion, and may not provide significant information to the user. Subject headings further restrict our ability to decide upon a suitable vocabulary to describe these images. At the British Library, we make use of controlled subject headings to provide an access point to our materials. These standardized vocabularies do not always meet the expectations of users, and consequently can unintentionally cause confusion, frustration, and harm. A popular subject heading for historical depictions of bodily differences is abnormalities human. The application of this heading attempts to circumvent the challenges of describing specific images by providing a catch-all term, which can be applied to any human deemed to be abnormal in the cataloguer's judgment. The image provided here shows a digital collection of images on the Wellcome Collection website, which have been gathered together under the heading and is accompanied by a disclaimer indicating that this page is under review. We have had constructive ongoing discussions with the Wellcome metadata team, who are confronting the same ethical cataloging challenges as we are within their own collections, and it is interesting to observe similarities in historical practices at institutions. The inadequacy of subject headings can be further understood when applied to a specific instance. There are multiple images and broadsides in the Collectanea which depict or make reference to giants. The greatest density of these materials refer to the Irish giant, who was in fact 2 or more men working in late 18th century England. One of these men was Charles Byrne. Byrne was born in County Londonderry in 1761 and pursued fame as a human spectacle when he was a teenager. He eventually arrived in London in 1782, aged 21, and he was an instant celebrity. However, his health declined shortly thereafter and he died aged 22. His fame was brief but significant. Byrne's body was stolen and was put on display in London by the surgeon John Hunter after his death. Byrne made express arrangements towards the end of his life to ensure that he was not dissected and displayed after death, requesting that his body be sealed in a lead coffin and buried at sea. Despite this, his skeleton was put on public display in the Hunterian Museum in London until only a few months ago, when a decision was made to take it down. Now, Library of Congress subject headings provide a few options to describe people like Charles Byrne. The most popular is giants, a term which is applied interchangeably to both folkloric giants and people of a certain stature. Considering this term is the same one that was used in the late 18th century to advertise Byrne as an attraction, it seems deeply inappropriate to use here. The entry for the subject heading provides some alternatives, including abnormalities human, as we've seen before, or stature, tall. The latter subject heading may be considered the least ethically questionable choice, but is it really an accurate description to use as a tag? The function of subject headings is to describe what something is about. Is an image of Charles Byrne really about tall stature? And will users use this term to find these materials? As before, we can also consider a medical approach to subject headings. Genetic research in 2011 has suggested that Byrne had a rare mutation in his AIP gene that resulted in the growth condition known today as acromegaly. Not easy to say, never mind find, for which there is a subject heading. However, this approach suffers similar limitations to discoverability, as already discussed. Furthermore, the information we have about Byrne or Lambert is unusual. Most of the individuals that feature in the Collectanea are represented only there, and no other biographical or medical information is known about them. How do we describe the conditions of those lives that are lesser known? What position are we in as custodians of historical material to speculatively diagnose anyone based on limited evidence? And furthermore, will researchers be looking for these specific medical terms when, in fact, they want to study the subject of tall people in Georgian human exhibitions as a social phenomenon? These questions are not trivial. They must be carefully considered in order to record a description of an image which is both accurate, discoverable, and appropriate. This paper has sought to introduce Lyson's Collectanea and the particular challenges that it has presented through the cataloguing process. These materials in this collection are undeniably offensive to modern sensibilities, as is the very concept of a human exhibition, and there is no language that can obscure that fact, nor should there be. The language of these materials and the historical phenomenon they represent are morally repugnant, but the language we use to make them accessible, discoverable, and useful as sources need not be. There is a duty of care to ensure that our representations of these people, be they catalogue records or exhibition labels, allow users to look with the subjects, not simply at them. Walking a line between discoverability and ethics is no simple task, and is one made harder by the limitations imposed upon us by restrictive cataloguing standards and controlled vocabularies. However, it is important to critically engage with the methods we adopt when describing these materials in order to provide the fairest possible description. I promise to pose more questions than answers in this paper, and I certainly think I have fulfilled that promise. There's no final answer here. The descriptions I create for these items today cannot anticipate the expectations of researchers of the next generation. Therefore, our goal as ethical catalogers must not be towards absolute standards which we can codify into policy, but rather to adopt an approach to descriptive cataloging which is carefully considered and continuously critical. thank you very much for your time, and I welcome any questions.
All right, we have a question from Meg Ryn. As someone who spent a long time working with American circus material from the 19th century, I have to ask if you've run into Tobin Siebers and his concept of complex embodiment. I found it a helpful way to balance the medical versus social models and address the nuance of lives lived, the question of consent about choosing to display one's body, and how users are likely to think about searching.
Thank you very much for raising that. I haven't actually come across anything that they've written. No, so I'd be very interested to read more about that. I mean, when I started cataloging this collection, I had what I now look back at as a woeful ignorance about disability studies and how that can be sort of practically applied in sort of our professions. And since then, I've sort of had my eyes widened to a huge amount of literature, which has all been sort of incredibly informative. And particularly speaking not just to colleagues, but people whose lived experience also speaks to this. I think, yeah, it's incredibly valuable to keep learning, keep making oneself aware of these ignorances to inform descriptive practice. But thank you very much for raising that.
As always, please feel free to drop your question in the chat, or if you want to ask directly, just let us know, and you are free to unmute yourself and ask. I actually do have a question for you, Alex. I was wondering about sort of exploration of the reconciliation between communities who prefer identity first language versus communities who prefer person first language, and sort of how to navigate that, especially when even within the community there's no disagreement, and then also as well as like capitalization versus lowercase, such as like big D, little d, def.
Yes, absolutely. So I think there's been sort of, from what we've spoken with people about this, it's been very difficult to come to a sort of final conclusion on how we should approach our materials in this regard. But I would say that, so for example, the two cases that I presented there, Daniel Lambert and Charles Byrne, we're somewhat fortunate in the position that we can present them as individuals, and that we can put named authorities in the records, so that when people are researching them, all the material related to them and their lives is gathered together. And when you look at that sort of network of materials, you don't see the identity of the individuals, either as they're identified today or as they were identified then, but you see their biographical history. And that's been sort of incredibly useful, particularly in the case there was another individual who's heavily referred to in the Collectanea, who I was unable to speak about in the presentation, called Sarah Biffen, who spent 10 years of her childhood mostly at charter fairs, and eventually managed to escape and became a professional artist. And very, very recently, the first exhibition of her work in a gallery in London, I think for the last 100 years or so, went on in December. And Sarah Biffen is someone who, until really the last couple of years, no one has known very much about at all. And now suddenly a huge amount of research is coming to light about her work, her paintings, and her life beyond her disability. And so I think in these instances, it's really valuable to take the research and the information that we get from our cataloguing and contribute to named authority records, so that we can have sort of the full biographical information of these individuals and have their identities up first and foremost when we create entries in the catalogue.
Folks, a few more questions, or a few more minutes for questions. As like I said, you can drop it in the chat, or you can let us know if you want to unmute and ask. This is, you know, especially when I'm thinking about like some of the prints that we have in our collection. This is such a necessary effort to learn from and think about and include into our own practice. And I also just really loved your point about like dogmatic standardization sort of being the enemy of sort of care when looking at the individual. So, and if nobody else has any questions, I would like for you to talk a little bit more about that, because that's something that we think about a lot when we talk about searchability.
Yes, well, I think sort of the rigid structure of things like subject headings or controlled vocabularies. I think they're a sort of bane to anyone working in certainly libraries, I know, but I suspect across different museums, galleries, archives as well. And it's a very difficult thing, because obviously there is huge benefit to having these controlled vocabularies to describe things, so we can pull together information and an increased discoverability. But it is also a huge frustration, and one that requires a great deal of thought. There's a huge amount of hesitation. So really, when I was describing a lot of these materials, these prints, be they of Charles Byrne, Daniel Lambert, Sarah Biffin, or whoever else was represented, or people whose names we couldn't even provide, I looked through sort of every single possible subject heading, not just Library of Congress either, but looking at different types, fast subject headings, and looking at medical subject headings to find what was most appropriate. And really often nothing was appropriate, or everything had some kind of issue. And in the end, we had to take a position that it's better to do something than nothing here, because what there was before was absolutely nothing. You couldn't find these materials at all. They were completely hidden. The only thing, like I said, describing them was the euphemistic title page, which I think really does far more harm than anything else. So we have put in subject headings for a lot of these, in the hope that they'll be more discoverable and accessible. But we're also aware that they have their own problems, and we're quite open to the fact that we will have to go back and revise these records as time goes on, and reassess which sources we use which thesauri we use when getting subject headings or general controlled vocabularies.
I think we have time for one last question, and it is: are there any efforts to create a local or alternative vocabulary for disability, like homosaurus?
Yes, there are. That's hopefully one of the main outcomes of this, is that so we fortunately have a disability staff network at the British Library who have worked with our team quite a lot in cataloguing the Collectanea, and collaboratively we're hoping to use the sort of examples drawn from this project to inform some kind of alternative vocabulary on the local level. And that would be used not just in our cataloguing, but also in all communications that we use, exhibition labels, interpretation, things like that. It's difficult to then apply that further, because obviously we want to conform to standards that are used beyond the British Library. So that's why we adopt Library of Congress subject headings and fast subject headings. And we have lesser control over that, although of course they are also revised over time. But yeah, the short answer to your question is yes, we are developing an alternative vocabulary for local use.
We've got about 30 seconds to squeeze in a very dense last question. Are you able to say more on some of the decisions that were made in cataloging this material at this stage? Very dense question. Great question.
Very good question. I don't think I'll be able to answer it adequately in 30 seconds, but I will try. Yes, so it's largely a process of consultation as much as we can. So like I said, we're working with other institutions, other groups, both researchers, library professionals, activist groups, basically to get a multiplicity of opinions, so that what we pick isn't just our own. It isn't just a small group or one person deciding. It's not just down to cataloguer judgment, which has far bigger control of what you see in a catalogue than a lot of people suspect. So it's about inviting more people into the conversation, but also at this stage, we're aiming for uniformity and consistency. So if we're doing something wrong, then at least once we've identified that, we can go back and change it en masse with relative ease. So those are, I say, that the two main things at the forefront at the moment. But currently there's a lot of things going on, but our priority is just to catalog it first, so that there's something there, and then revise it and go back and continuously revise it and expand that method out to all of our collections, hopefully.
Thank you very, very much, Alex. This was a fabulous presentation. And we're just going to take about 30 seconds to switch over to our next one. Thank you all.